To this now, civil society organization Corruption Watch is set to release a report on land and corruption in Africa tomorrow. The report, titled The Story of the Marginalised, addresses the link between land, corruption and discrimination. Corruption Watch's work on land and corruption in South Africa focus on the plight of people who live and work in farming communities, specifically in the Western Cape. Melusi Ncala is a senior researcher at Corruption Watch, and he joins us now. Thank you so much for your time. Let's talk then about the importance of having to portray a report that links land, discrimination and corruption, especially when you consider that millions of South Africans, black South Africans, have never owned land for generations.
Yeah, I mean, this work comes at the backdrop of us having done extensive work looking at corruption and human rights violations. In fact, in recent years, there's a report that came out from Transparency International that links the two. And prior to that, we have already been working on land corruption issues. So the natural cause of doing this work led us to connect or look at the intersection of land, corruption and discrimination. And it's important for us to do so because when we look at the land question in South Africa, tied to that is the fact that it was an economic crime. And since '94, when the government has been professing or claiming that it's trying to deal with it, there have been huge corruption issues. And one of those issues relate to the land policies or land programs that it's been rolling out since '94. And one of those programs is called Farm Worker Equity Schemes, which is one of the areas that we're looking at in this particular work.
Now, we know, of course, as you say, Transparency International has been working on this extensively over 10 years, I would imagine, but of course, in the greater African continent. Just talk to us about some of the issues, behind the delays, especially when you look at the land reform program in South Africa.
When you look at the equity schemes issue that we've picked up, at least, is the fact that government went to commercial farmers and commercial farming businesses, told them that, we're going to incentivize you working with farm workers if you will upscale them, teach them about the business side of farming, and of course, then hopefully that these people will then one day become owners of these farming businesses, or at least significant shareholders of these farming businesses. The commercial farmers took advantage of this whole thing because some of them were not financially secure, so they figured it would be an easy way of making a quick buck. Consequently, hundreds of millions of rands were spent, and what we have now is a situation where farm workers, the majority of them, are not equipped with business skills. Some of them are suffering human rights violations. They're not given adequate housing. Some of them are being evicted. Some of them work under very strenuous circumstances where they suffer injuries, no medical care. It's a nightmare when you look at what's happening in the agricultural sector.
When you treat, this report, just talk to us about the methods that you have undertaken and the journey that you have also gone through, because behind all of these statistics, particularly looking at the farming community, are real people. Just talk to us about, some of the uncovering that you have, made during this documenting phase.
So the series is called, it's a podcast series, because we felt that complementing the report, people have to hear for themselves the voices of farm workers. And so then we conducted a case study looking at farming areas in the Western Cape. One of the main ones is Witzenberg. And Witzenberg is essentially responsible for billions and billions of rands in revenue when you look at the agriculture sector. But what you see happening there is that it's controlled by mainly 3-4 main companies, and these are white-owned companies who have claimed that they have on board beneficiaries acting as shareholders. But when you look at the circumstances of those people, and these testimonies, you can hear it from themselves when you listen to the podcast, you hear that these people are not being paid wages. Some of them rarely ever get dividends, and those who have received dividends, they get dividends as little as 400 rand per year, and they happen perhaps every 10 years or every 2-3 years. So it's a very sad situation that we see happening in these communities.
This, of course, is part of a greater whole in uncovering the depths in which corruption affects, people who live in especially remote areas in South Africa. What are your hopes in terms of this report that is formed in the form of a podcast, in terms of, ensuring that those that have been marginalized eventually do get some form of compensation? They do get some form of justice?
Well, there needs to be justice, because when you look at this, the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development has been complicit. At least some of its officials have been complicit. They have been responsible for setting up some of these equity schemes. And what you see is that some of them have been collaborating with these commercial farmers. So we're going to need law enforcement to actually look into this, the Public Protector's Office perhaps being one of those agencies to look at it, to see, first of all, how do we hold these officials accountable? And then, of course, the monies that have been lost to these companies have to be recouped in some other way. So we will be working with social partners and law enforcement, hopefully, if government wants to come on board and rectify this and to fix it. Because one of the things that we also expose in the podcast is the fact that government has been well aware of what's happening in this. They've conducted a review of the situation, and they've been hiding it from the public.
Are you able to, based on your report, quantify just how much has been lost? I mean, of course, from an emotional perspective, I would imagine that is impossible. But just in terms of trying to find, tangible convictions, particularly because you are trying to bring in law enforcement agencies.
It is at this present moment very hard to quantify, because we look at, in some instances, people have not been paid their wages, as I've mentioned, dividends have not been paid. So there have been financial irregularities and mismanagement of funds. We need to understand as well that in a period since about 96 until 2013, the government spent hundreds of millions of rands on equity schemes. So who knows how much some of these commercial farmers actually benefited for themselves in that amount. And then, of course, there's the issue of housing. Some of these beneficiaries have been living 20, 30, 40 years on these farms, and they don't have adequate housing, and they've been evicted. So at this point in time, it is very hard to measure the extent of the loss, but it is huge.
All right, Melusi, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Melusi Ncala is a senior researcher at Corruption Watch. Thank you so much for that. Of course, the report comes out tomorrow, and it is a title story of the marginalized addresses the link between land, corruption and discrimination. Let's continue here now.